Hey, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Funny thing happened to me on the way to RSA. I retired, and now Dave Luber is the chief of the cybersecurity directorate. So we thought we would make this a tag team this year and go through the state of the hack, what NSA has seen, what we've taken away from the past year in terms of the major hacks, the technology trends, and what you ought to be conscious of, what you should be thinking about in this arena.
Hey, thanks, Rob, and good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Luber. I am the new director of the Cybersecurity Directorate at NSA. I've been with NSA for 37 years, and I'm really happy to be here today to go through State of the Hack. We've got a lot of important things to cover today, and I want to make sure that we jump right into the presentation. So why don't we get started? Just take a second there. Okay, you've got that. All right, we're going to talk first about edge devices. You know, it's been a pretty busy year already for exploitation of edge devices. I'm counting 9+ significant exploits among many different company edge devices. And of course, this is of a concern, because if you think about how the PRC exploits and uses edge devices to get into critical networks, whether they're government networks, whether they're allied networks, or whether they're networks in our critical infrastructure. You know, these are devices that are on the edge and protecting the perimeter. But what I would say is, you know, if you're just using these edge devices for perimeter protection and that's your only protection, it's clear that's not going to work for you. Just look at the 9+ exploits that have happened over all those different company areas. And think about it. The main reason why these edge devices are so popular for exploitation, it gives the actor, the malicious actor, that first point of entry into a sensitive network or into a network. It also gives the actor the opportunity to do credential harvesting, to lay down persistent presence, to make sure that they have the infill exfil point, so that as they're conducting exfil of sensitive material out of that network, they can control whether or not it's being logged or whether or not you're actually even going to see that activity is going on. So we really have to think about a broader set of security beyond just the edge devices. First and foremost, when a CV is found on an edge device, we need to patch and patch quickly. But you need to have multi-factor authentication. You need to have zero trust behind those edge devices to make sure that when a breach occurs, there's minimal opportunity for those adversaries to move within and deeper into those networks. So really, I'm going to turn it to Rob now for a couple comments on his view as well on the edge device problem.
Yeah, so I think the year started off strong, right? Those of you who are in the security side, we were patching our Ivanti devices January 10th. And you know, it has not been many months where we've seen Ivanti, Cisco, Fortinet, Citrix, all of the big names that we expect to be those boundary devices. Internet facing is the key. Right? And Dave talked about there's a host of CVEs discovered this year. So there was 0 day piled upon 0 day in some manufacturer cases. Those devices that are that separation and entry into your network are going to be the focus of both nation state actors and the ransomware crews, because they present and are internet accessible. So your VPN concentrators, your firewalls, your file transfer devices, right? Over the past 12 months, we've seen a lot of focus on those file transfer appliances as well. Why? Again, internet-facing, large data, attractive places, either for the bypass of the security boundary or because they contain substantial information themselves.
Thanks, Rob. Let's go on. Wait a minute, one here? I think we have. I'm sorry, I have one messed up card here. We're going to talk about the targeting the cloud. So let's talk about targeting the cloud. You know, 5 years ago, everyone started to move into the cloud environments, and even 5 years and beyond, and really moving lots of data into the cloud. And of course, what we have now is that's the big target. That's where everyone is focusing exploitation. So most recently, we've seen in the news Midnight Blizzard. Midnight Blizzard being active in trying to exploit cloud services in commercial clouds that we depend on across the U.S. and government. And going back even a little bit further, SolarWinds, that same actor, SVR, they were really focused on manipulating trust. Same now in the efforts that we see in Midnight Blizzard, focusing on cloud technologies. So when we think about this exploitation, it's not just the cloud environments that we need to protect. We also have to think about the path in which SVR, Midnight Blizzard, takes from their vantage point and then gaining access to those target areas like the cloud environments. So it incorporates exploitation across some of our key telecommunications networks, key service providers, as they use techniques like password spraying and other capabilities to gain that initial access. Of course, still very important, I mentioned multi-factor authentication. It's also important for cloud environments as well, because if you have single-factor authentication, that password spraying technique is going to become very useful for the adversary.
Yeah. So Dave talked about one of the big cloud breaches in the Midnight Blizzard exploitation. The other was the Storm 0558 activity, where the Chinese went after the emails of the Commerce Department and State Department before a major diplomatic engagement, right? So that was very traditional espionage, but where did they go? They go to the cloud, because we in government and private industry trust the cloud more and more with our sensitive data. And so we've got to now have the trust in the cloud, because frankly, we lose some of our visibility into the environment. Sometimes you don't have access to all the logs that a provider would have. Sometimes CVEs aren't issued, right? If you had on-prem equipment, you would understand the flaws you were exposed to. I think we've got to get to the point where we understand where the flaws have been in those architectures and what's being done to secure us. Mandiant's report this year talked about an increase of about 75% in the exploitation of the cloud environment, so the growth year on year. And I think from our NSA seat, we had seen that same thing. We saw the focus pivoting to the cloud. Why? Because that's where the data is today, right? That's where we're going. We also saw a unique trend in Scattered Spider, was looking to get into the cloud to then pivot inside your network perimeter and your security space. So Scattered Spider went to the cloud to steal documents that then they could in turn use to understand the VPN credentials and access procedures inside a protected domain on site, right? And so you've got to think about what data do you have in the cloud that might also be used to get further into your supply chain. So it's an area to watch as we all invest more and trust more in the cloud.
Yeah, Rob, I think we were talking earlier, cloud environments have become very complex. And I think when it comes to the work that we have to do with industry, the work that we have to do with our analysts, it's more important than ever, I think, for us to have our analysts working side by side to really focus on some of these advanced threats. Your thoughts?
Agree. I think that collaboration, the ability for NSA to go out and look at the long distance space. I think yesterday you talked about the telephoto lens that NSA has.
That's right.
And then you think about the industry view as this wide angle lens. The ability to go out and marry those two viewpoints together is what we need to get after some of these sophisticated exploit efforts.
Great. Let's talk about ransomware groups. Ransomware continues to be a national security concern. I think it was a wake-up call, and I think everyone can reflect on the Colonial Pipeline incident, where I think the first time that we really looked at ransomware as sort of a national security issue, along with the broader cybersecurity topics of the day. But just this year, the focus has been heavily on the Change Healthcare incident. And in that particular case, a significant impact to both U.S. economy, to the services for healthcare across our nation. and to the people, the American people, where ransomware actors, largely operating outside of all operating outside the U.S., I should say, and then conducting these activities that impact the U.S. in a very significant way. You know, our role at NSA in these kind of activities is, you know, focusing on the intelligence and then sharing that intelligence with those who can make a difference across the United States government. Because it's not just about what we can bring to bear from an NSA perspective. In many cases, you need to bring to bear the full capabilities of a national power in order to make sure that we can tackle some of these challenging ransomware cases. So whether it's partnering with FBI, CISA, Treasury, Commerce, many different authorities and experts across U.S. government, along with industry and select foreign partners. This is what really helps us get after some of the ransomware issues.
So Dave, one thing that didn't change this year was the continued debate about whether you pay ransom, right? That's still a hotly debated topic. I think we got a new data point with the Change Healthcare. You know, they tried to pay a ransom, and in the end, surprisingly, the thief ran off with their money and didn't give them anything back, right? So you've got to understand, if you choose to pay ransom, you may not be able to recover your systems even with that payment. You know, it's clearly the case that when you're under existential threat, you know, you've got to consider that option. But I think the investment opportunity to be protected, to keep them out of your network, and to be resilient so that you can rebuild that network without having to resort to paying ransom, that's the place we've got to strive to get to. Because, you know, there's not honor among those thieves. And when you look at the pressure that many of these organizations are under, you know, it just adds insult to injury that they go and pay a ransom and then it doesn't get them back on track. And even if you pay the ransom, there's still a huge hole to dig out of to rebuild those systems and to get back up, even if you can decrypt your data.
Yep, exactly.
So a few more thoughts, Dave. You know, I'd like to highlight just, you know, where in that community we are today. One of the interesting things was the FBI and the Lockbit work. They've done an extraordinary amount of work, but they, you know, in conjunction with DOJ, did some indictments recently. Yeah. How's your role in that?
So again, our ability to share insights with those who can take actions under their authorities is really the role we play at the National Security Agency. So very happy to see Department of Justice and FBI focus in on Lockbit, using their authorities to bring some additional pressure on that particular area.
Yeah, the other thing I'd want everybody to think about in that Lockbit environment, you know, FBI and a bunch of international partners actually seized infrastructure, right? They took over their websites. They're in that ecosystem. You see the big takedown banner notices and other things. And I love it that, you know, a new site pops up pretty quickly. That actually is pretty good, because now the question in everybody's mind amongst that community, is that really Lockbit back online, or is that FBI? Or is it somebody who has flipped and is inside the organization that is bringing it back up, but now everybody you're talking to is part of an evidentiary chain that's going into the law enforcement, over into Europol, over into the NCF in the UK, the FBI and others, right? So you erode that trust amongst the criminals, and that adds friction. Am I really talking to who I think I'm talking to? Am I actually giving my Bitcoin to somebody who's going to launder and wash it and give it back, or is it just going to be seized, right? So those things where we as a community can provide the insights into that ecosystem, see the seams and the breaks between them, and peel people off for advantage, that's an important capability that the governments across the globe are really leaning into.
Yep, agree. Let's go to the next topic, Russia-Ukraine. Still on our minds is the Russia-Ukraine activity, and as well as the cyber activity associated in that particular domain. So just to take you back a little bit, you all recall the activity that first occurred from a cyber perspective, focused on the KSAT attack early in the conflict, and that's where, you know, tens of thousands of satellite modems were impacted by Russian activity, Russian attacks against the user segment of those VSAT networks. The one thing, though, that we didn't see in the early stages was what we might consider to be broad-scale attacks. There were some wiper attacks, and there was the KSAT attack, but the big bang never really happened on the Russia-Ukraine scenario. What I think we've seen, though, is sort of a bit of a strategic shift, and that strategic shift is now focusing more with Russian intelligence services conducting intelligence collection versus preparing for computer network attack operations. You know, in intelligence collection, that provides potential advantage for battlefield operations. So now more than ever, as we continue to support Ukraine across industry and government sharing insights, is to make sure that we help bring some of the best cybersecurity practices and solutions into the Ukraine's toolbox. It's really critical that we don't allow Russia to gain an advantage in the information domain. We have to ensure that as we're providing support and providing insights to the Ukrainians, that they have some of the best technology, the best insights, and the best guidance possible to help protect their networks. Of course, it's also important to think about the countries around Ukraine, because we also see activities that are targeting those countries that are providing logistics support and other aid going into Ukraine. So we have to also protect NATO, we have to protect allied countries in and around Ukraine, as well as making sure that even our own homeland is prepared and protected as well. Rob?
Yeah, I'm going to use a sports analogy. You know, I think, you know, the efforts inside Ukraine and here domestically, they were the touchdown, right? There was the protection that kept the infrastructure safe and actually deterred Russia from coming at us here domestically. I think as we look at the art of the possible, the idea that you're resilient, that you're watching and disrupting some of the capabilities, you know, the community efforts against snake malware, the community efforts to do a number of CSAs and advisories about infrastructures, tools, and techniques used by the Russians have really given pause to the desire to move that beyond the theater of conflict. And as Dave said, really the place that matters right now is the intelligence production, whether it be battlefield intelligence, supply chain intelligence, or the intelligence about the coalition and how we're going to fund, resupply, and support the Ukrainian effort. That's really where the efforts are focused, and that's where we've got to make sure we're pinching off that flow of capabilities to the Russian intelligence services.
You know, Rob, you used a really important word, resiliency. I think that we can see that American technology that's gone in to provide resiliency has really helped the Ukrainians, whether it's in the cloud service area or whether it's in the satellite and communications area. It really has presented, you know, additional capability and additional resiliency for the Ukrainians. I think it's a lesson learned for all of us, because I think if you think about cybersecurity alone, without thinking also about resiliency, we're missing part of the equation. So I think a lesson that we can all take from what we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine, is think about resiliency in your systems. Think about resiliency in communication, resiliency in where your data is, and whether or not you have single points of failure. Okay. Let's go on to hacktivists or nation states. Wow, okay.
Sounds like a game show.
It does. It's like a game show. All right, so look, you know, we just got done talking about Russia, but Russia is really a multi-pronged threat. Certainly there's the state actors that we were just referencing during the Russia-Ukraine activity, but also there's hacktivists operating in and around Russia that are targeting the U.S. And most recently, we've been seeing these hacktivists' car, as an example, targeting inside the U.S. against some of our smaller water system, municipal water systems, focusing on attacks against OT devices, right? And you know, some of the smaller water systems in the U.S., they don't necessarily have the same expertise as everyone here in the crowd here. They don't have a CISO, they don't have a cybersecurity staff, so they're implementing technologies, and in many cases, some of those technologies are implemented with default passwords and default configurations that enable hacktivists in Russia to have nearly immediate access with ease of maneuver against those particular devices. So first and foremost, one of the things that we had to do as a community is make sure that there's some good guidance out there for those small to medium-sized municipal water administrators. So collectively, NSA, CISA, FBI and others put together an OT configuration guide just a couple weeks ago, got that out, not just to folks that would normally get our advisories, but also focusing on state and local municipalities, making sure the distribution of those insights get out there broadly. But again, I think this is just another facet of Russia that we have to contend with, because when you think about it, we are very concerned on our side about having these sort of attacks occur against our water systems, but I don't see Russia having much concern about what's happening inside their own country. You might even say, and some might say, it's tacit approval to allow this to happen outside of within the borders of Russia. So Rob, I'm going to turn it to you for some comments and thoughts.
Yeah, so Dave talked about Russia in the guise of activist or nation state, right? The role of those hackers inside Russia who are reaching out because of the political affiliation and the world situation. But it's not just Russia. If you look the last year, we had Russia, China, and Iran all ran operations against U.S. water OT systems. None of that was significantly consequential, but just the fact that those countries had hackers who would come at our critical infrastructure should be a wake-up call, right? Each and every one of you who is in this community ought to be kind of thinking about that trend, that there are people out there who, when there's global tensions, feel that their role is to take up cyber arms and bring those against whoever their opponent is, right? And we're seeing that in many cases be at times the US, but we've seen over the years, we've seen Iran, Israel, right? We've seen Russia, US. We've certainly seen Ukraine, Russia. So it's going to go both ways. And then you get the added specter of, at times, the nation state intelligence services are wrapping themselves in the cloak of that anonymity of the hacktivist to go out and give it a nudge even further, right? So they want to push and prod in their political agendas. I think the area to watch, as I said, no consequential impact, but at some point, somebody's going to land one of these in a place against critical infrastructure that's going to matter. And I don't think they're doing the assessment of really how significant that attack will be, right? The implications of it. We could see somebody tip the scales by overachieving on one of these attacks without understanding the implications.
Yeah, Rob, and I think the area of most concern for me is that when cyber can turn to physical, right? And the outcomes of a cyber attack, especially in critical infrastructure, turns to some sort of physical impact, whether it's in some of the smaller scale activities, water overflowing, but then more broad scale, you can just use your imagination on where some of those physical manifestations and impacts can occur just based on a cyber activity from a
That's a great lead to the next area. Right?
Exactly. So let's go into targeting critical infrastructure. And while it says targeting critical infrastructure, the main topical area here that I'm going to talk about and begin with is Volt Typhoon. So we've had different discussions here at RSA already on Volt Typhoon, but just think for a moment, we've always been tracking the PRC's efforts to steal intellectual property, to conduct intelligence collection against U.S. government and allied systems. But what's different about Volt Typhoon is the placement access into our critical infrastructure for the purposes of computer network attack at the time of their choosing. So they're inside of our fence line. They've gained access to distinct systems across our nation in order to conduct a computer network attack when they choose to conduct that attack, with the intent to cause societal panic, and with the intent, we believe, to also have some of those impacts that I just mentioned, cyber to physical. This is a major concern. And while NSA plays a key role in sharing insights from an intelligence perspective, industry plays even a bigger role. Because when you think about the team effort that's required to find this living off the land activity, the living off the land techniques, I'll just reference back to our May of last year publication of the first hunting guide on Volt Typhoon. If you take a look at that hunting guide, very detailed on how to find this actor inside of critical infrastructure networks, inside of potentially even government networks. But the acknowledgement section in that particular advisory, 10 plus companies across the United States that contributed to the insights on building that hunt guide. Just demonstrates how important it is for us all to be working together, partnering together to counter these very sophisticated, very important threats that we're facing in our nation.
So let's talk a little bit about why it's stealthy and hard to find, right? These activities had gone on for several years. There were some wisps and small amount of smoke around the edges of the activity, but there wasn't a real understanding of what it represented. It took, after a while, the contributions of intelligence and those network reconnaissance views, as well as some incident responses into some of these companies to find and put together that end-to-end story. Why was it so hard? Well, they use living off the land techniques. They're using techniques that are often the theft of an identity, the ability to pretend to be a legitimate user, or inserting a new user that has legitimate credentials on that network. And if you think about the things Dave talked about they're trying to achieve, they want persistence and long-lasting penetrations into these networks. They're not there to take terabytes of data off your network. They're there to be able to understand the topology and the capability of these networks, the capability of your OT systems, and to be able to disrupt the business processes and the OT processes at the time and place that they're choosing. So that means that they don't have to move a lot of data across your network boundary, which is, in the case of data theft, one of the best indications that you have a problem, right? You start to see unexpected data movement. They're able to burrow deep, come in every 15, 30, 90 days, and just retouch those accounts to verify that they're still able to get in, that the topology hasn't changed significantly. That's a really quiet activity, especially if they're using legitimate credentials. So that's a hard lift to detect and find, but it's one that, from the far end of intent through the infrastructure that's used to connect them in to the data you have on the way your users should behave. That's a chain that we've got to put together to break and disrupt the access that they have.
Yeah, Rob, I think you brought up a really important point, because if many of the companies out there are rolling their logs every 30 days or every 60 days, you might miss this activity. You might not be able to see the patterns of this aperiodic access just to make sure that they have that placement and access that they need. So we have to think a little bit differently, not only about how long we keep logs and how we're analyzing those logs, but then also how we're making sure that we have stronger controls on identity management and how we make sure we know who's inside of our networks.
So Dave, what are the sectors that you're seeing them focused on, and where have we found some of this activity?
Well, I won't be able to go into any particular victim areas, Rob, but I think when I think about sectors of whether it's transportation or energy or even government, I think there's some concerning areas that we have when it comes to what we've seen so far.
Yeah, and I think the key areas, if you're involved in capabilities that would help the U.S. military mobilize to Southeast Asia, they're looking to be able to disrupt that. If you're involved in something the U.S. population requires for modern everyday life, those are the kind of places they'd like to dig into and be able to disrupt.
Yep. All right, Rob, thank you. Let's go on to the next topic. So we're going to stay on the PRC theme a bit, but changing and shifting a little bit to think really about the hacking ecosystem of the PRC. We've talked a little bit about why and how they're doing activities, but we're going to dig into a little bit about what's behind the curtain. So you might imagine that there's all sorts of hackers in the PRC, but what you might not be thinking about is how the companies within China are supporting the hacking ecosystem. So when I think about the companies, I think about the tools, I think about the infrastructure, and I think about the exploits that are being developed to support the entirety of the hacking system and ecosystem within the PRC. So, but I think what's different that we see is that these companies are complicit with the actual hackers themselves.
Say it's not so.
Well, Rob, it might not be a surprise, but it's also seeing them part of the hacking activities beyond just building tools, helping provide infrastructure, and then providing some of those exploits. So, Rob, your thoughts?
Yeah, so the big elements of the Chinese government hacking ecosystem are the PRC Cyberspace Force, the military arm, and the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, right? Those are the elements that have the government hackers. But they don't get to do their operations without an ecosystem that provides them one key aspect, which is the infrastructure that gets the hackers on the keyboards from the government spaces out into the internet and sheds the Chinese connectivity to the point that they can touch their victims. One favorite place that we see them doing is they're using SOHO routers, small edge devices throughout their target countries, whether it's the US or others. And they will take over and gather these into large botnets that can be used to transit through multiple hops, ending inside the country that's being targeted. So in our case, inside the US, hop out of a small cable router and then touch their victim. And so these cable routers might be used for days, weeks, or months, but they're ephemeral. They're thrown away, and they give a new clean IP address that then can be used for the hacking activities that aren't on anybody's block list, right? So it's great that you block China, that you make sure you don't have Russia connecting to your network, but in reality, nobody of any professional ilk is coming straight out of one of those countries toward their victims. They're going to buy VPNs. They're going to take over these small devices, and the ability to hack IoT devices at scale is a huge problem. You see us partnering with CISA and others talking about that secure by design need, right? That we don't have default passwords, that we have an upgrade path for a lot of these devices that live on, again, are natively exposed to the internet, where they can be gathered and collected en masse. That's a really important thing. But finally, if you're interested in this topic, go look at the iSoon data dump. There's a company in China called iSoon. They support the PRC, and they give examples in that data dump of all the different aspects of the way they support this ecosystem. They're selling vulnerabilities, finding and selling vulnerabilities. They're providing hacking infrastructure, but they're even running their own operations. So they're out there gathering hacking, pulling back data, and then providing it to their government customers in anticipation that they can steal data that the Chinese government would be interested in.
Yeah, Rob, I think that is the best example. When you want to see how the companies in China are complicit with and even supporting the hacking operations, that iSoon dump is really a great example. And we expect that there are many, many other companies doing the same thing. Yep. All right, let's go to the use of AI. I mean, you can't come to RSA this year without hearing AI at least 100 times during a brief. But you know, what's important when we think about AI and NSA is we know that many of our national security customers are going to be using AI, and we need to make sure that we're providing the best guidance possible on the application and use of AI in national security applications. So about 6 months ago, we set up the AI Security Center within NSA, right within our Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. And we have 3 main objectives that we have for this center. One, detect and counter threats that would be impacting the use application of AI systems. The second is drive deep and persistent partnerships across the AI community, not just with those who are developing AI capabilities, but also those who are implementing AI solutions across national security applications. And then third, and really important, develop, evaluate, and promote best guidance for securing AI systems. So you go and look on 15 April, we published our first cybersecurity advisory on deploying secure AI systems. You can find that on nsa.gov, but just know that's not going to be our first and only advisory on this particular area. There's much more work to be done because this is an evolving area. It's changing rapidly, and it's critically important that government and industry work together to make sure that we can build and have a secure AI system for not just national security, but many different applications across the U.S. Rob?
Yeah. If you look at AI threat, we're seeing each and every one of the major nation states and the big cyber groups playing with AI today, right? They all want to understand how it's going to work into their workflow. I think the near-term assessment is it advantages the social engineering aspects of hacking tremendously. By using an AI system, you can correct non-English speaking language. You can make culturally relevant phishing emails. You can create audio deepfakes, even video deepfakes that will enable you to get into some socially engineered access, right? That's where we're seeing it today. We're not seeing AI-enabled technical exploitations. We're certainly seeing AI used to scan and find vulnerabilities at scale. We're seeing AI used to understand some of the technical publications and new CVE publications to help craft end-day exploits. But the tremendous development of O-Day for hacking activity, not here yet today. What we're also seeing is the ability to use not just GPT-style AI, but the more traditional AI to look at large-scale data in your logs to find things like the living off the land techniques that would be somebody impersonating a user. So AI analysis of your logs, your data at scale will pop out the non-traditional uses of your services and hopefully identify some of that manipulation that's going on.
Thanks, Rob. I think a key area for all of us to continue to stay focused on and continue to collaborate on. It's truly a team sport as we work through this one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about threats to space systems. We know that cyberspace is a contested area, but space is also a contested area. And I want to just kind of walk through a little bit about, how I think about and how we think about the ecosystem of space and where cybersecurity plays a key role. So first, if I break that down for you, I look at the ground segment, the user segment, the link segment, and the space segment as kind of being the ecosystem for space. And in each one of those different areas, we have to consider the cybersecurity ramifications and how we protect those different areas of that ecosystem from threat actors, whether those threat actors are focused on cyber threats or whether those threat actors are focused on other electronic warfare type impacts. So think about the ground segment first. It's a lot of IT systems just like we would use in any other network. There's some other specialized systems like network management systems that help translate the data into then assignments for modems and RF and things like that. But it's the most highly focused and attacked area because it has those common edge device vulnerabilities, other non-patched devices like operating systems and other areas where attackers can get right in and start focusing on attacks against that ground segment. And of course, what's at the ground segment? Often the data. That's where data resides, and that's where the attackers are usually most interested in gaining access to the data. But now let's talk about the user segment. Now we're starting to get into more specialized areas when you think about cybersecurity. The modems. The KA-SAT attack in Ukraine was all about an attack against the user segment, the modems themselves. So we saw Acid Rain, the wiper that impacted the KA-SAT modems. In March, the Ukrainians uploaded a new version of that particular malware, Acid Pour, that would also impact other modems and other even devices that could be seen in mobile systems. But think about it, we still have to consider the threats to that user segment. Having the firmware patched on your modems, making sure that you configure transect so that the next part of the ecosystem is protected, the link segment. If you leave that link unencrypted, if you leave that link open to potential exploitation, those with more sophisticated techniques have the ability to impact the link segment. And then the space segment itself, let's make sure that we're protecting the space segment, the satellites, with the right level of cryptography. So I'll just take a couple more minutes and talk about some work we've been doing with the Space Development Agency this past year and the last couple years as they've launched 27 low Earth orbit satellites to support the Department of Defense. We've provided NSA high assurance cryptography for the ground segment, for the link segment, for the user segment, and the space segment. So bringing to bear cybersecurity and high assurance encryption to make sure that we protect all parts of that ecosystem. And in addition, our teams have focused on providing new capabilities to the Space Force and Space Development Agency so that we have modernized Link 16, which is command and control from space to ground systems and weapon systems that would be deployed anywhere in the world. First time ever that we've been able to put modernized Link 16 from space, again, assured with high assurance NSA cryptography. So that's some of the things that we do at NSA as we see the adversaries that want to focus on threats to space systems. We also provide solutions to make sure that we deny that access. Rob?
That's great, Dave. So I think we're about out of time. Why don't we open it for any questions you guys may want to ask? Please use the mics if you've got a question from the mic stand. All right, please.
Hi, really good talk as always. You emphasised the importance of partnerships, and that's been a theme that's come up sort of through the week in other panels as well. I notice that we continue to see changes to some of the key internet protocols which are hiding or encrypting some of the significant indicators of compromise. One of the issues we have is that in terms of partners, a lot of governments, a lot of the security industry, end user enterprises aren't present in those fora, so they're not explaining why that's a major problem for security. Is that something that's on your radar and that you can do something about to actually drive some changes there?
Standard Center.
Yeah, so one of the areas that we have in our Cybersecurity Collaboration Center is a focus on standards. So we participate and provide guidance for standards, and an important area for us, and an area that we'll continue to focus on.
Yeah, the other thing we're trying to do is, U.S. industry needs to turn up at standards bodies. They have the expertise, the understanding of both how it impacts them commercially, but also, where these security standards need to be immutable, right? We will see some nations come into standards bodies with an agenda to actually weaken and put in the ability to repress their populations. We need the U.S. ethos inside the room, and the way we get to scale is through industry participation. So we definitely support that. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, final question.
Thank you. I have a question about AI. Some of America's crown jewels are here in Silicon Valley when it comes to the technology. And in recent months, we've seen that several large companies have had cases of employees, Chinese employees, trying to steal data. To which extent, and they have been indicted, to which extent are you concerned about China using individuals and trying to get to Silicon Valley companies' knowledge? Thank you.
So I think obviously we have concerns whether it's penetrations from China into companies, or whether it's remote access from a hacking operation. We need to protect intellectual property across the AI ecosystem, and in part, some of the guidance that we published in our recent publication on 15 April really focused on how you make sure you secure your own supply chain inside of your company, and making sure you understand who has access to the data itself.
Yeah, let's be really clear. The technology leadership in America is out in front on the AI. There are a number of countries who are looking to close that gap, and they will do that through industrial espionage, and that comes across, as Dave said, in multiple tools. That comes across in cyber tools, but also insider tools. There are ways you ought to be instrumenting inside your company to understand that insider threat, and also to have data loss prevention policies and techniques that keep somebody from being able to, as a malicious insider, remove that data and give it to an adversary. So it's an important area, yes. Thank you. All right, thanks everybody. That concludes the talk.
Thanks everybody.